Welcome to this explainer. Okay, we are jumping right in today. We're unpacking a profound, deeply relatable existential crisis. I mean, we're talking about the true story of a guy who seemingly had absolutely everything a person could ever want, but then suddenly and completely lost his reason to live.
It's a pretty haunting question, right? Think about it. What happens when you climb all the way to the absolute top of the mountain? You achieve literally everything you set out to do, and as you look around at the peak of your success, you realize none of it actually matters? Well, we're going to explore how this exact brand of existential dread struck one of history's greatest minds right at the absolute height of his powers, and how he desperately fought to find a way out.
The mind we're talking about here is Leo Tolstoy. The legendary author behind massive hits like War and Peace and Anna Karenina. And the source material we are breaking down today is his raw, totally unfiltered, deeply personal text called A Confession. He wrote this in his early 50s, and honestly, it is not some sweeping historical epic. It's a harrowing, super intimate account of his own midlife crisis and his frantic search for the absolute truth. So let's start right at the beginning with Section 1, The Illusion of Success. To really understand Tolstoy's devastating fall into despair, we first have to look at the foundation he spent the first half of his life building, a foundation he ultimately realized was a complete illusion. After ditching his childhood faith at the university level, the young Tolstoy spent the next 10 years chasing what most people chase, right? Wealth, pride, social standing. He openly confesses that he just yielded to his lowest passions. He fought in wars to kill, he gambled, he lived pretty loosely. To get fame and money, he realized he had to hide the good and display the evil, basically writing purely for applause from the literary elites. He essentially became a priest of this false religion of progress and culture. And that brings us to Section 2, the existential crisis. You see, his strategy of chasing fame and money, it actually worked incredibly well. But by the time he reached his 50s, despite having a loving wife, a family, a massive estate, and literally worldwide literary fame, his life came to a terrifying, grinding standstill. This quote brilliantly illustrates his absolute paralyzing despair. He started having these moments of perplexity, where the simplest questions would pop into his head. What is it for? What does it lead to? He felt like he had walked all the way to the edge of a cliff, only to clearly see that there was absolutely nothing ahead of him but destruction and death. Everything he had built just felt like a cruel, stupid joke. The narrative whiplash here is just immense. I mean, this was a remarkably healthy, incredibly fortunate man, a guy who could physically keep up with peasants working in the fields and mentally write for 10 hours straight. Yet, the gravitational pull towards suicide became so incredibly strong that he had to play tricks on himself. He literally had to hide ropes from his room so he wouldn't hang himself, and he actually stopped going out hunting just so he wouldn't be tempted to turn his own gun on himself. To really ground this overwhelming dread into a visceral reality, let's move to Section 3, The Dragon and the Well. Tolstoy relies on this ancient Eastern fable to perfectly capture his psychological state, and it is intense. Let's walk through the imagery here. Imagine a traveler fleeing from an enraged beast on an open plain. Desperate, the guy jumps into a dry well. But looking down, he sees a dragon with its jaws wide open just waiting to swallow him, so he can't go up and he can't go down. He clings desperately to a tiny twig growing out of a crack in the wall. As he's hanging there, hands getting weak, he sees two mice, one black, one white, circling the twig and slowly gnawing right through it. Knowing he's inevitably going to fall to his death, the traveler notices a few drops of honey on the leaves of the twig and reaches out with his tongue to lick them. Okay, so what does this all actually mean? Decoding this metaphor shows us exactly what Tolstoy was going through. The drops of honey, those represent the joys of his life, his love for his family, his incredible passion for writing and art. But hanging in the well of existence, that honey just no longer tasted sweet to him. The black and white mice represent night and day, the relentless, unstoppable march of time, slowly gnawing away at his life. And the dragon at the bottom, that is the inescapable reality of death. He couldn't unsee the dragon, and because of that, the honey of his success completely lost its flavor. Desperate for a lifeline, we enter Section 4, The Failure of Science. He turned to the sum total of human knowledge, basically begging to find an answer to why he should keep living. But what he discovered was a massive intellectual dead end. He split human knowledge into two distinct camps. On one side, you have experimental science. It was perfectly exact, sure, but it completely ignored his question. It essentially told him he was just a meaningless lump of fermenting atoms, mutating in infinite space. Ouch. Then, on the other side, you have abstract philosophy. Thinkers like Socrates, Schopenhauer, Solomon. They actually addressed his question, but their answer was just as depressing. They entirely agreed with him. They concluded that life is vanity, emptiness, a literal evil that we should all wish to be freed from. So science couldn't save him either. Let's move along to Section 5, 4 Escapes from Despair. Realizing the greatest thinkers offered zero hope, Tolstoy looked around at his own circle of wealthy, educated peers. He categorized their coping mechanisms into 4 distinct escapes. First up is ignorance, simply not being smart or aware enough to realize the dragon is even there. The second is Epicureanism, knowing the dragon is there, but distracting yourself by overindulging in wealth and momentary pleasures. The third escape he called strength. This is realizing life is a stupid joke and having the energy to decisively end it right then and there. And the fourth escape is weakness. This is seeing the hopeless truth, knowing death is better, but lacking the strength to actually act, so you just weakly drag out a miserable existence. And Tolstoy, brutally judging himself here, admitted he fell right into this fourth category.
But spoiler alert, he didn't stay there. That brings us to our final section, Section 6, the leap of faith.
So the absolutely crucial point here is how Tolstoy finally broke out of this vicious, hyper-rational circle that was urging him to end his life. The breakthrough actually came when he realized his own massive ego had created a huge blind spot. I mean, he and his wealthy, educated friends weren't the only people on Earth, right? He asked himself, wait, what about the milliards, the billions of working-class people throughout all of history who carry the heavy burden of life without despairing? How did they survive? Looking past his own privileged, kind of parasitic elite circle, he started observing the simple, unlettered folk. These were people whose lives were full of heavy labor, deprivation, real suffering. Yet they accepted illness, toil, and death with a profound tranquility. Why? Well, because they possessed a type of knowledge that his highly educated intellect had completely rejected. They possessed faith. And this brings us to one of the most powerful conclusions in his entire confession. Tolstoy realized that reason alone, the very thing he prized above all else, actually destroys life. It inevitably leads you straight to the dragon. But faith makes life possible. Why? Because faith is the only mechanism that connects a person's finite, temporary existence to an infinite, eternal meaning. Without connecting the finite to the infinite, life just remains an unsolvable, super depressing equation. To wrap up this huge revelation, Tolstoy uses one final, honestly beautiful image. He realized he had been sitting in a boat, having dropped his oars, just helplessly drifting down a rapid current of despair, toward destruction, entirely surrounded by other elites who were practically celebrating as they drifted to their doom. But faith provided him the oars. He realized he had the freedom to pick those oars back up, row hard against the current of modern rationalism, and head back toward the shore of God, tradition, and the working people. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative thought to consider today. We live in an era that absolutely worships intellect, data, and rationalizing every single part of our existence. But what if Tolstoy was right? What if our modern obsession with rationalizing everything is exactly the thing that blinds us to the very purpose of our own lives? What if meaning isn't found in a textbook or a bank account, but in the simple, irrational act of faith and dedicating your life to serving others? It's a profound challenge from a man who had it all, lost it all, and found it again in the most unexpected place. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you on the next one.